ask questions, because they're usually questions that people that can't ask questions on the other side might want to ask. And it allows the teaching to be extended, expanded beyond the surface concepts that are often delivered. So I'll run through some of the general concepts, the framework, and I'll try and run through it quickly today. And then I'd like to expand on a few sub-concepts or concepts that fit in with the overall framework. Someone's asked for me to speak about relationships and the broken heart. And so if people are interested in that and I forget to bring it up, ask me. There's also, I'd like to speak about the working mind and the thinking mind, and the difference. So I'll start off where we normally start, which is keeping it practical, keeping it relevant, and trying to keep it in such a mind space that means we don't get lost in concepts, because it's very easy to hear something that sounds appealing and to believe it. And once we hear something that's appealing and we believe it, then we might tend to start seeing it around, and it might actually not be there, or we might be seeing it at the expense of seeing a fuller picture. So to the extent that we can keep relying or going back to our own experience in practical daily living, and the concepts encourage that, because the concepts are concepts about practical daily living. They're talking about the dynamics that happen right here, right now, as we're living life. So if we keep coming back to that experience, then we can't fool ourselves too much. And if we ask the question, what am I really looking for in life, and come up with an answer for that, then we can keep reminding ourselves whenever we feel that we're off track, whenever we feel we're lost, we just come back to this question. So what am I really looking for? And if we have a good answer to that, the answer says, so where have I gone off track? So the suggested answer is that we're all looking for happiness. Happiness in daily living for us, the individual. So in this case, looking for happiness for Roger. It seems like we're not exactly sure what happiness for ourselves is, because we haven't necessarily got it on a continuous, unbroken basis. But if we look at the movement, it can become very clear that the ingrained belief that drives us unconsciously is the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found in circumstance being a certain way. My happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 which means when life looks a certain way, then everything will be okay. So moment after moment, we're trying to control life in order to get it to look the way we think it needs to look in order for everything to be okay. And we've been following that strategy for our whole life. It seems like humanity has been following that strategy. Not stupidly, it makes sense why this is the case. It's the case because pleasure is about the best that we've got so far. So on that basis, we keep seeking after pleasure. Something needs to break that. Something needs to short-circuit that belief system. If it isn't short-circuited, then it makes sense that the ingrained belief, which is believed to be true, that's what a belief is. A belief is a concept. I need such and such. in order to be happy. That's a concept. And it's believed to be true. And beliefs are terrible things because they turn something relative into an absolute, which is an error. And if we're running off an error, it means that everything that follows after the initial error is an error. So a concept can only ever be relative, which means we need to relate to it as such. We need to relate to it as relative. We can't turn it into something absolute. We've got enough experience for ourselves to show us that happiness is not to be found in pleasure, not to be found in circumstance. We've sought after pleasure or circumstance, and time again we find that we get pleasure, and the pleasure is pleasurable, but it's not continuous, unbroken peace of mind. It's not continuous, unbroken happiness. It doesn't satisfy us on an ongoing basis. And so that information, plus our own experience, should be enough to start short-circuiting the ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in circumstance. And the suggestion here is that happiness for the human being is something very different to what we've believed it to be. Happiness for the human being turns out to be not gaining something, not the addition of anything, but the absence of something. Happiness for the human being turns out to be the absence of suffering. And the absence of suffering is peace of mind. So intellectually at least, we can start to work with these concepts. The first concept is, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. My happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. I've had enough experience of having circumstance turn out the way I want it. Yes, it's pleasurable, but it doesn't deliver continuous, unbroken happiness. And I'm told, and I want to investigate, that happiness for the human being turns out to be the end of suffering. The end of suffering is peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. And suffering, in practical terms, arises in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So happiness for the human being turns out to be the end of that type of thinking and feeling. And when we look at the basis of that thinking and feeling, we find that the first three forms of suffering, guilt, blame and pride, stem on the basis that I am the doer and the other is the doer. Meaning an attitude, a way of seeing ourselves as being something separate, independent, and in control of everything that I think, that I feel, and that I do. And if we see ourselves that way, then we have to see the other as the same, a separate, independent entity in control of everything they think, feel, and do. And this makes sense, because the experience that we have is an experience that suggests, I am the doer, I am separate, I am the thinker of my thoughts, I am the actor of my actions. And because that's the experience, the deeply ingrained belief has been put in place. The belief that is being formed based on the experience. And so when we see ourselves as this separate, independent entity, we have to blame ourselves, which is guilt, for anything that we do in life that delivers a negative outcome, an outcome that effectively is pain to myself or someone that I love or even a stranger. And I have to blame the other for whatever they do that delivers pain to me. With that belief in place, that reaction has to happen. It's not something that we can avoid. We could resist it. It can happen, and we can intellectually say, I shouldn't be feeling like this. But it's not going to stop it, because the deeply ingrained belief is going to see what is happening differently. But if life starts changing the deeply ingrained belief, then what will happen is that life will continue to unfold as it does. Pleasure sometimes, pain at others. The others doing things that deliver outcomes that are not preferable. Actions happening through me that deliver pain to the other, not necessarily intentionally, but it happens. Or actions that I do that delivers pain to myself. And without that deeply ingrained belief, that flow of life continues to unfold, but the reaction that happens is no longer a reaction of guilt, blame, and pride. Pride is based on the same principle that I am the doer, but in relation to those actions that happen through me that deliver pleasure. And to the extent that I feel pride, meaning look at what I have achieved, the belief is in place and being reinforced, meaning that each time we say, look at what I have achieved, we're really saying, yes, I am the doer. We put a tick next to it, say, yes, I am the doer. And with that belief in place, guilt and blame are just around the corner. They're around the corner, and they'll flower when life unfolds in such a way that pain is delivered either through my actions or the actions of the other. So that's the first half of human suffering, based on the belief I am the doer and the other is what we would like. So if a water pipe bursts in the house, the attitude of non-attachment accepts that that is what has happened in the moment. It accepts that, or the preference is for the water not to keep flowing uncontrollably and flood the house. And so biologically there will be a movement to try and fix the pipe, either using our own skills or calling a plumber, knowing that whatever we do, the outcome is not in our control. So we call the plumber, and the plumber says they'll be there in half an hour, and 5 hours later they still haven't arrived. Or we try to fix the pipe, we think we've done a great job, we go to bed and we wake up in the morning with the whole house flooded. Or we fix the pipe, we think we've done a great job, and we have done a great job. Sometimes we get what we want, sometimes we don't. So acceptance of what is doesn't mean that biologically there isn't a movement to try and improve the situation. But once we have done what we can biologically, the attachment to the outcome is not there. So we can sit back, relax, and see what happens. So all of the suffering that arises stems out of the thinking mind. The thinking mind is just a label that is being given here as part of the conceptual framework to point at the part of the brain that functions a particular way. So the basis of the thinking mind are these core beliefs that I am a separate independent entity in control of everything that I think, that I feel, and that I do, and that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So those beliefs reside in the thinking mind, and on top of those beliefs are a myriad of other smaller beliefs, like all of the shoulds and shouldn'ts that I need to do in life. I should do this, I shouldn't do that. All mini strategies of how to get the pleasure that we think we need. Strategies that, when we stick to them rigidly, are effectively confirming the belief that I am the doer, confirming the belief that I need these outcomes in order to be complete. And they create an obstruction to our connection. Which is why in those moments in life when we finally realize I have options, I'm not actually as restricted as I think I am in this moment. I feel restricted in this moment because of my list of shoulds and shouldn'ts. the list of shoulds and shouldn'ts that tell me this is how I should act and this is how I shouldn't act. And so a whole range of options that are actually available to us are overlooked as options. We can find ourselves in relationship, for example, with I should stay in this relationship because it's good for my spiritual growth. Or I should stay in this relationship because without it, I'll have no support. I should stay in this relationship because it delivers financial freedom. Or I should stay in this relationship because what would my children do if the marriage broke up? It would be terrible for them. Now, this isn't to say that some of those things are not accurate. But when we believe them absolutely, we sometimes cut off options that when life pushes us to a point where we can no longer stay in the situation because the uncomfortableness gets too strong. And I'm not talking about an uncomfortableness of circumstance so much, but more an uncomfortableness where we just feel that we're not honoring our true nature. We're not living from a place that honors our true nature. So if we live from a rigid set of shoulds and shouldn'ts, at some point life makes it unbearable for us to remain in certain situations. And when we make the change, the freedom that's often felt is undeniable. It's like, why did it take me so long? The answer is fear. We are afraid to make change because of the imagined consequence. The consequence that we imagine is pain in the moment. And our attitude to pain in the moment is that pain in the moment is an attack on who I am. Pleasure in the moment is a completion of who I am. And so this keeps us afraid because we imagine a certain outcome and it's unacceptable to us. Only to find that when life pushes us to a point where we make that decision, the outcome may be painful, but we find that it isn't as detrimental to our being as we expected. In fact, quite the opposite. We find that there's a liberation on some level because we've now moved more in line with what we feel to do, meaning moved away from following this rigid set of shoulds and shouldn'ts. So all of that type of thinking resides in the thinking mind. The thinking mind is continually looking at what's happening, judging it as good or bad relative to its idea of how life should be. The working mind, on the other hand, is the part of the brain that thinks, and it thinks in such a way that is functional. The working mind is the part of the brain that can calculate mathematics, can communicate, can work out what shopping needs to be bought when you go to the shops, can calculate how much money to take on holiday. So the working mind doesn't disturb our peace of mind. The working mind is thinking, but it's not the type of thinking that creates an uncomfortableness with oneself. So the idea that we have to sit in a state of no mind, a state of absolutely no thinking, in order to know ourselves and to be happy, is usually another belief that has been put in place by life. All our beliefs, all of our conditioning is not our doing, but rather a happening according to how life has impacted us moment after moment after moment. So these core beliefs have been put in place by life. Life delivers new conditioning moment after moment after moment. And each moment, the new conditioning either adds to the existing conditioning, which includes all of the beliefs that we have, or it radically changes the up-to-date conditioning. So at each moment, we contain a certain set of up-to-date conditioning. And that up-to-date conditioning is continually changing. So this brings us to the makeup of the human being. The human being is one way in each. They are the way that they are. And when we look at what constitutes the person in that particular moment on a biological level. When we look at what constitutes the human on a biological level, we find it's based on two factors: genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if there's a third factor that we can find, then we have to look at this concept and say, well, maybe it doesn't make as much sense as it's presented as. But the more we look, we'll find that on a biological level, the human being is always made up of these two factors: genes and up-to-date conditioning. And we'll find that we weren't in control of our genes. We weren't in control of the parents that we were born to. So the genes are the hardware, in a sense. And once we're conceived and the genetic structure is in place, we're not in control of how life impacts us moment after moment. And life impacting us moment after moment is the new conditioning that is delivered moment after moment, resulting in up-to-date conditioning at each point in time. So the human being is made up of these two factors: genes and up-to-date conditioning. And when we look at it for ourselves, we find I'm not in control of the way I am in this moment. And the reaction and the response that happens in each moment is a result of the circumstance that we find ourselves in, something also that we're not in control of. We step out of the house or out of the hotel onto the road, and we find ourselves in a situation that we didn't create, a situation that we're not in control of. And then we find ourselves responding or reacting to the situation we find ourselves in according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. A response or a reaction to a circumstance that we've always considered to be my doing. And on closer investigation, we find that what I believe to be my doing is a happening, is a reaction or a response, a mechanical reaction or response based on the biological mechanics of the body and the circumstance we find ourselves in. Thinking is a function of the brain, and the brain is part of the body, also dependent on genes and up-to-date conditioning. In fact, a whole lot of the up-to-date conditioning exists in the brain. And so this is why the concept is being put forward of the working mind versus the thinking mind. So it is life that put us into a certain circumstance where event or circumstance happened in such a way that was very painful, let's say. And then the response to that circumstance, sometimes by the child, is a response where it is taken very personally, a response where the pain in the moment is felt to be an attack on who we are, an attack on our completeness. The child looks at how that pain was delivered. It was delivered through the other. You hurt me, I hate you. Now this is not only a child's response, it becomes the response that we have in most situations in life when pain is delivered to us. So if we send off a message to someone asking for some information, and they see the message, and so we can see on Facebook, seen, and we wait for the reply. And 10 minutes later, and no reply. 1 hour later, still no reply. And the thinking starts. It was a very simple question. I said it was urgent. They've seen it, and they haven't replied. And then 2 hours later, no reply. A day later, no reply. And this thinking about why the person hasn't replied. And that thinking is part of the thinking mind, basically blaming the other for acting the way that they acted. The working mind, on the other hand, can look at the message and say, I sent the message at 2:48, it's been 2 hours, no reply. It could even say, this is inconveniencing me. The working mind won't create a story about how the other person should be or what this means to me. One of the reasons that humans suffer is because the intellect in a human is developed sufficiently that we have the capacity to conceptualize our own existence.
I have a question with the thinking mind.
Sure.
it's also thinking mind is also going on without any event happening. Like you're walking down the street and the thoughts are running. So, but that is different from what you said when somebody hasn't replied or things like that.
So when someone hasn't replied, you're holding on to the circumstance in time. And when the thinking mind is functioning, when you're just walking down the street, it's usually thinking about the past that it's still holding on to, or the future that hasn't yet happened. And so even though it doesn't seem like there is a circumstance at hand, what we'll find is that the suffering that happens when we're walking down the street is a continuation of a circumstance that happened 10 days ago or 10 years ago.
So, I mean, the events will pop up in your memory unless you have resolved them? Because even like you're sitting quiet and suddenly something comes up.
That's if it hasn't been resolved and it's been locked away in the system as a unresolved situation, meaning unresolved where you are, meaning that you looked at it from the perspective of personal doership and attachment to outcome. And so if that's how it was looked at, there would have been guilt or blame towards yourself or towards the other. And that guilt or blame is an energy that is uncomfortable. And if it's in place, it will continue to function. It will continue to not be at rest. And the experience that we have of that type of energy is this continuation of the mind along a certain track, either in reference to that particular event or in relation to life in general and relating to life according to that attitude that's been put in place. And so what we think is no circumstance, because we're just walking down the street and nothing in particular is happening, could just be the presence of life. The presence of life that continually inspires a certain attitude to life. An attitude that was put in place by life itself, based on our history, based on a series of events that have happened. And because life has put in place this conditioning, and the conditioning that's been put in place in the thinking mind we can call the belief in personal doership, which underneath the umbrella heading belief in personal doership are the two substructures. One is belief in personal doership, I am the doer, and the other is the doer, and the other one is, as the doer, my completeness is dependent on pleasure, on outcomes. And so while that structure is in place, life is continually going to be an experience of uncomfortableness with oneself on either mild or more extreme levels.
And not wanting, like if the thoughts are coming up and you're like, oh, I don't want them because I was quite peaceful and you just disturbed me. So that would be attachment for pleasure, because if they're bothering me so big.
So when there is a resistance to suffering, it's the belief in personal doership that kicks in and says, this is pain in the moment, or even worse, this is suffering. So suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself. The belief in personal doership judges that as appropriate or inappropriate and says, I would like life to be another way. And it then sets out asking the question, how can I change this? How can I change it, but with a strong uncomfortableness with the situation? So the thinking mind starts off from a place of uncomfortableness and resistance, and then tries to solve the problem from that place of misunderstanding. So the thinking mind says, this is not acceptable, I don't like it, I don't want it to be like this. If the working mind were to start looking at the situation, it would look at the situation and say, this is pain in the moment. Pain in the moment, assuming that the working mind has the required up-to-date conditioning in it. The working mind will look at the situation and say, this is pain in the moment. Pain in the moment is part of the flow of life. The flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. So this pain is understandable as part of the flow of life. Is there something I can do about it? If the answer is yes, I can ask someone to change something, then the action could be to send off a message for someone to change something, knowing that the outcome is not in our control, which means no attachment to the outcome. And so the working mind tends to see things in a more objective manner, meaning isn't taking life as personally, and understands that even once we try to do something, sometimes we get what we want and sometimes we don't. So when the question comes up, so how to have this continuous unbroken peace of mind? If we're lucky, we'll notice that what we're really looking for is the end of psychological thinking. The thinking mind, all it does is psychological thinking, based on the idea that I'm the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in circumstance, and therefore life needs to look that way. If we're lucky, we'll see that this question is a question of the thinking mind. Often it is. And the very question itself, especially when it's coming from a place of real uncomfortableness, this is when we generally ask, how can I change this? The question itself is the doer in us that is first judging this as not what is wanted, and secondly saying, so how do I change it? And freedom from psychological thinking is what we're looking for. And so if this is part of the thinking mind, then that's more psychological thinking. And what we're looking for is freedom from psychological thinking. So the working mind at some point might realize, oh, that question, how do I fix this? How do I get this continuous unbroken peace of mind? That question is the functioning of the thinking mind. And when the working mind realizes this, it realizes what I'm looking for is the end of the functioning of the thinking mind. So even this question needs to stop. Now, when that question just stops, because we realize that that in itself is suffering, that in itself is the non-recognition that what I am right now is already complete. What I am right now doesn't need to go anywhere or change, doesn't need to be developed. If that psychological thinking of what do I need to do in order to fix the problem, if that stops, we either find ourselves in a space of empty peace, where the emptiness is not an unfortunate emptiness, it's a very self-contenting emptiness, or we find ourselves drop down into the layer of suffering below the thinking mind that says, how do I fix this? Because the question, how do I fix it, comes from a layer of suffering below. If we drop into the layer of suffering below, it might feel like this is not particularly satisfying just to stop asking the question, how do I fix it? Doesn't give me any great answer. But what it does do is it uncovers the next layer of suffering that hopefully we are equipped, hopefully the working mind is equipped to look at that uncomfortableness that we drop into when we stop trying to fix the problem. And then we might be able to see the thinking pattern that is also of the thinking mind that is functioning on that next level. So this is where often the understanding of these concepts on an intellectual level is is underestimated. We sometimes think my peace is the end of thinking, and even thinking about how I need to fix this and what all this is in itself the problem. I just need to stop. And that can work. We can stop. We can find ourselves in a place of emptiness, but that doesn't actually deal with the ingrained beliefs that are in place. And so what happens is we find ourselves dropping into this place of being and continually being dragged out again, because life unfolds, triggering those deeply ingrained beliefs, and we find ourselves back in the thinking mind again. So this isn't to say that just dropping into being is not worthwhile practice. In fact, it's extremely worthwhile, because when that happens, what is seen is that timeless essence of the human being. What is felt is the completeness that we already are. And knowing that for ourselves experientially becomes a very significant piece of information that maybe we didn't have before, that demonstrates that the beliefs in the thinking mind are not accurate, are false. We know experientially when we drop into being that everything is okay. Circumstance remains maybe not so fantastic. Drop into being and it's all okay. If we could stay there and still find ourselves functioning in life, then nothing more to do. But the reality is that people have become very familiar with being, very familiar with this space of awareness. And yet, once we're back out in the flow of life tends to pull us out of that space of being. And so if that's the case, hopefully there's a curiosity that grows, that starts looking at these dynamics, looking at them using the intellect. And as the intellect becomes more and more focused on the dynamics that are spoken about here, and the only things that are spoken about here are those aspects of daily life that are completely relevant to the question that we started off asking, what am I really looking for? And the answer is, I'm looking for happiness. And it turns out that happiness for the human being is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. So all of the concepts that are being delivered here are completely relevant to the thing in life, the only thing in life we're really looking for. And what we find is that this continuous, unbroken peace of mind is the end of suffering, and it stems from a recognition of our connection to Source. It stems from us recognizing the essence of the human being. And a recognition of the essence of the human being shows us that what the human being is in totality is a combination of impersonal consciousness of Source that has linked to a particular body-mind, a vehicle, and is functioning through that vehicle as personal consciousness. So the experience that everyone is having right now is the personal consciousness experience. The experience of impersonal consciousness functioning through a particular instrument. And even when that experience becomes very impersonal in nature, when it feels like the person has dropped away, that is still a personal consciousness experience. It's still impersonal consciousness functioning through a particular vehicle. It's just a very impersonal version of that personal consciousness experience. And so that will happen from time to time. We might find ourselves sitting looking at the sunset or looking at a river, and the experience becomes one where the individual has fallen away. That doesn't mean it's changed from being a personal consciousness experience. It means it's just a very impersonal version of personal consciousness experience. So from this perspective, we can start to see that the experience we have in each moment is a combination of impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a particular body. The body is unique. It's a unique vehicle. We can liken it to an appliance in a house. and let's say there's 5 different appliances: a heater, a fan, a fridge, and a radio, and a television. And there is the same undifferentiated electricity plugged into each of the appliances, and that undifferentiated electricity functions through each of the appliances and is expressed in a unique form from one appliance to the other. So the heater expresses heat, the fan expresses movement, the radio sound, and so on. And the human being is a bit like that, a unique vehicle through which the one undifferentiated consciousness of source functions and expresses as Rogerness or as Jennifer-ness. And so the experience that we're having in each moment is not my separate experience. This idea that there is God out there and me. This idea is a belief in the head that keeps us from seeing what is really happening right here, right now. God is having an experience through each of us. The experience that you are having right now is the same experience that God is having, but that doesn't mean that there is you and God. It actually means something much more intimate. It means that what we are is God seeing through a particular instrument. So waiting, when we hear that God and you are not two, we can wonder, what does this mean? And what it means is something very simple, but something quite profound. That God is not out there watching what's happening through CCTV, some central control station that has access to everyone's experience. But rather, God is experiencing life through each individual, and it's my experience in this moment which is God's experience. They're not two. And this applies for everyone. It's not unique to some people. Everyone is having an experience that only happens because the impersonal consciousness of Source has linked to a particular body and is functioning through that body and seeing the world from that perspective. And this is presence. If we come back, this is what God, this is what consciousness is. This word consciousness, sometimes, for years we read about awareness and consciousness, and I know for me I'd sort of skip over the word in a sentence, so I'd read it, but I had no real frame of reference as to what this consciousness that's being referred to is. All there is consciousness. Everything is consciousness, or everything is awareness. Everything is source, or everything is emptiness. So it sounds very nice. You read over it, and at some point it starts to make more sense. We start to have more of a frame of reference as to what it is. When it really clicks, consciousness, it's palpable. Once awareness turns in on itself, it's, that's always been here. And that's the consciousness, that's the big consciousness that everyone's been talking about, is the consciousness functioning through me right now. We have to drop the idea, which is another belief, that the universe is very, very big. Millions of light years in that direction and that direction. The universe, in practical terms, is this big. As big as fits into the awareness right now. And so a belief that the universe is here and all the way out there is a belief that keeps us from presence. The idea that there is a here and then there is London and Paris and America, that's all hearsay. When we're really present, it's just, this is it. This is the universe. And the universe arises inside what I am. The I am being the awareness of Source, the awareness that recognizes what's present right here, right now. So if we have an idea that there is a God, and we have an idea that there is a here and a there, those ideas, those beliefs, basically keep awareness from landing on what is right now. We'll be waiting for the day when I recognize that I am awareness and that the whole universe arises inside of what I am. We have this idea, one day I will know the universe. You don't need to wait till one day, you can know it right now. This is it. This is what knowing the universe is. The basis of the universe is all the same, consciousness, because the universe in this moment is an arising in consciousness, like a dream at night is a arising in the consciousness of the dreamer. And the consciousness in which the world arises is this consciousness that is functioning through us. And we can maybe at some point start to realize, oh, what I am is the consciousness and not just the body. The body is an object, like all of the other objects that arise in this consciousness. And that can be a significant moment where the body is seen to be an object, like all the other objects. We've lived our life as though I am this subject, thinking that the subject is the object. So once the body is relegated into the space of form, the subject, which is aware of all form, including the body, can recognize itself as that in which the whole universe arises. And once that happens, that's not the end of the story. We don't end up living as consciousness. We end up living as the human being. This is just a recognition of the core of the human being. This is the awakening to the fact that, this is what I am, is the space, but actually that what I really am is the human being. And the human being is a combination of that spacious consciousness functioning through a body. And so then we can come back and live as the incarnated expression of Source. And we can say, now the experience is an experience. It always has been an experience designed to feel like I am this. Previously, I thought I am this as a separate, independent entity in control of everything that I think, feel, and do. Now there's a recognition that what I am is always connected to Source. That Roger, there can't be the personal consciousness experience unless Source and the body are connected. And the Roger experience, the personal consciousness experience, is a combination of the two. So I'm not one or the other. I'm not consciousness and I'm not the body. I'm the combination of both.
I just had a thought while you were talking. Okay, Source is expressing itself through our personal consciousness. And you were also talking about beliefs. I'm sorry, it might be completely destructured, but I'm trying to catch my thought that struck me actually. And you were saying that it was like a dream. I didn't get it because I was like, okay, then if I am a dream, so now I'm in India, and actually I don't have a house back in Paris. If this is what I'm understanding, that if I'm in a dream and personal consciousness is flowering through us, here I am, I'm here. Actually, then I don't have a house actually in Paris.
Right now, it's not verifiable.
Of course, it's not verifiable. I'm lost in this universe.
this is what I was just talking about is not how we live life. This is just to demonstrate that there are certain beliefs in place that prevent us from being really present with what is right now. Certain beliefs about a here and a there. Certain beliefs about a God that is out there and a me that is separate from God. So those beliefs create a experience. And if we question those beliefs, a bit like a meditation, a bit like a little practice, where we question those beliefs and say, actually, I want truth. This is a seeking for what is true. And maybe I'm believing things that I've been told, or believing things that I'm assuming based on experience. And maybe experience is not as infallible an indicator of truth as I believe it to be. Maybe what the others have told me is not as accurate as I believe it to be. So at some point we say, I'm going to just go off my own experience right now. Total presence. And if you come to this place, you go, well, I don't know that I have a house in Paris right now. So we don't need to go to the extent and say, I don't have a house in Paris. I don't know that I do. I don't know is a place that we come to when we're starting to go through this process. Actually, sometimes I don't know is a place that takes quite a long time to get to, because we listen to a whole lot of spiritual concepts and turn them into beliefs and think we know a lot of things. And after following a lot of beliefs, we find that if we go to our own experience, we find that I'm still not comfortable with myself in daily living. And then that recognition is that I've tried everything I can and I can't make this happen. Maybe I'm wrong about life being one or life being this or that. And we come to the place of, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. Which really is a letting go of a whole lot of beliefs. And in letting go, in coming to I don't know, there is a surrender of being the doer, a surrender of being the one that can know and can control life. A surrender based on our own experience that says, I can't do this, and I've believed a lot of things that are not verifiable in my own experience. So, I don't know is a very healthy place to be. And so in the context of this little experiment, which is specifically about saying that there isn't necessarily a God out there. We believe that there's a God that is separate from us out there, and we've believed that the universe is very big. So I'm saying let's put those aside for now. And what we might come to is a realization that if I'm present with what is right now, I find that all that I ever have in life is a momentary experience. That's all I ever really know, is the experience that exists right now. This is it. And looking at the present moment like this, like it's the whole universe, and that what is aware of the universe is the consciousness that is functioning in this moment. Daily life has never existed, an experience of now has never existed in the absence of awareness, the absence of consciousness. So in reducing the universe right down to here and now, what might become apparent is the consciousness or the awareness in which the here and now arises, or the consciousness or awareness that is aware of everything that is here and now. So that consciousness, turning in on itself, which it can't do when the thinking, very unconscious thinking, is continually believing about a here and a there. When we believe about a there, we just keep imagining things that we can't be aware of. And so this is just a little hint, suggestion of how to become aware of the consciousness that we have, but that often we have no frame of reference for, because the consciousness is continually looking outward instead of coming back to right here. And so in the English language, the word consciousness is not only used in spiritual seeking, but it's used in sort of everyday English language. And that too is a hint of what this consciousness is, the consciousness that's being referred to. Because in the English language, it's if someone were to hit you on the head with a baseball bat, you could lose consciousness. And so when we see what that's pointing at, it's this, we've lost consciousness. So the awareness that's functioning through the human being has stopped functioning when we say we've lost consciousness. And then when we regain consciousness, it's okay, we're back. It's like not only we're back, but the whole universe is back. And so we can then maybe use that as a little hint to follow. So what is consciousness? When I lose consciousness, and then when I regain consciousness. Because this consciousness is really intimate to us. It's the thing that's always been here. The thing that the momentary experience absolutely depends on. It's impossible for there to be an experience of life, or even an experience of meditation, or the experience of a dream at night, without consciousness being present. It's consciousness or awareness that recognizes the momentary experience. It's the one thing that remains ever present and constant. The one thing that remains unaffected and unchanged. It remains unaffected or unchanged by whatever comes and goes in the experience. And this is an aspect of the human experience that is overlooked. Awareness sees all of the content, and very rarely does it become aware of itself as the base, the background of the experience. So this is a little bit of normal topic. Normal topic is, and it keys back in, is what we're looking for is happiness for the human being. And happiness for the human being is the absence of suffering. And when we look at the suffering, we find the suffering is always based on this ingrained belief, I am the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And that stems from a false idea of who we are. A false idea of who we are as the human being, meaning that I'm the human being, but I believe that I am in control. And so the falling away of that false idea, meaning whatever happens through me is happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I wasn't in control of. Or, if we prefer, which is much more profound, but amounts to the same thing, that whatever happens is a result of the story of life, the creation of life, the arising in consciousness, which is like a dream. Whatever arises in consciousness is a story unfolding exactly according to the script or according to the creator. And the human beings moving around in life are part of the story of life. They're not separate from it. They're intrinsically one with the story. So if we look at a night dream, the main character in the night dream spontaneously comes into existence in the dream and might feel like it's separate and independent, but actually from analyzing the dream from outside, we see that whatever the character does in the dream is dictated to by the dream overall. The one character in the dream might come up to the other character and say, hey, do you know this is a dream? Do you know that you're not the doer? Do you know that it's through you is a consequence of the dream itself? That what happens through you is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning that the dream has put in place in order for your actions to look exactly the way they are. And the other character says, what are you talking about? I'm real. This is real. I'm in control of what I say right now. Look, I'm going to lift my left hand up. Look, I'm going to lift my right hand up. And the other character says, yes, that's exactly how this dream is created. It's a dream created for there to be the feeling that this is a reality and that you are in control of everything you think, feel, and do. And on the basis of that, the dream includes suffering, when the dream includes pain delivered to you in the flow of life, pain delivered through the actions of the other or through your own actions. And so the dream is a spontaneous creation that is created to unfold according to laws of cause and effect, created to unfold as if it is a story of time and space. And that's what we are living. We're living the story of time and space. We can't deny that on the surface, life is a story of cause and effect. And life has put in place these ingrained beliefs of personal doership in order for the experience to be an experience of suffering. And at some point, life starts to bring about a change. Life starts to change the ingrained beliefs as part of the story of life. And so it does it by putting us in situations like this, where we're exposed to concepts that point to the point or show us a different way of seeing the movements that happen through us. And if that new conditioning that is being delivered lands in a certain way, and I'm not in control of the new conditioning that's delivered, and I'm not in control of how it lands, and you're not in control of the conditioning or how it lands, if it lands a certain way, it can radically change your up-to-date conditioning, which means the dream then continues to unfold, but with new conditioning in place, which means new ways of being in life. And in practical terms, that means that life continues to unfold, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, but without suffering arising, without guilt, blame, or pride, worry, or expectation. That only happens if life undoes the beliefs in personal doership.
If that you gave this example of raising the hand, like I'm the doer. I mean, events in life that happened to me, like wow, that's miraculous. I'm here. I wasn't supposed to be here. Blah 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 blah. Yeah, not my doing, but this, my doing.
Mm-hmm. So
and I guess we have to be 100% sure that, I mean, if we are on the path of 100% sure that also this is not my doing, but I still believe that this is my doing. But
Sure.
the fact that I'm here in Rishikesh and it wasn't planned at all was not my doing. I can see it wasn't my doing.
Mm-hmm. So what happens is, let's say the function of the heart beating, it's clear to us that's not my doing. That's clear, it's happening, it's biological. And then other functions like thinking and speaking feel very much like my doing. Like I am the controller of this. If we see that thinking is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, so and the circumstance we find ourselves in. So if I ask you, what is your next thought going to be? I don't know. That was your next thought. It was inspired by my question, and you had no control over my question, and maybe no control over the response. So the question came, and a thought came. The same with the rising of your hand. You said you gave this example, and then you said you raised your hand and said you were in control of it. And if we don't recognize that what seems like my doing is actually just a consequence of everything that came before, that I was forced to react to and to behave exactly the way I did. So it's funny, in one of Ramana's teachings, satsangs, he brought up the fact that everything in life is predetermined. And there's a quote, the famous quote of Ramana's, saying that everything that happens is happening according to the great ordainer. And that no matter what is destined to happen will always happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to prevent it from happening. And what is destined not to happen will not happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to make it happen. And then someone did this, raised their hand and said, but I am in control of raising my hand. And Ramana's answer was quite simple. It says, you raised your hand because you found yourself in a situation where the suggestion was that everything is predetermined, and you raising your hand was part of the predetermined story, and it was a consequence to the fact that the subject of predetermination was brought up. So it's pointing at the fact that all of life is this flow that is happening. So the initial impulse, the Big Bang, if we want to say that, is like a bomb exploding. And when a bomb explodes, all the shrapnel sort of heads off and starts hitting things and bouncing around. And it's all happening exactly as it has to happen based on the initial impulse. And when the shrapnel and everything comes to rest, and we look at what's happened, we might be able to understand that everything bounced off the way it did because of that initial impulse. And what seems like a whole lot of random movements are all determined by that initial impulse. A bit like dominoes. You hit one domino and we know what's going to happen at the end. The outcome is already predetermined. It just hasn't. It's already happened. When the first domino is pushed, the outcome has already happened. We're just waiting to see it unfold. And so we can look at the example of a pool table with the triangle of red balls and the white ball and a cue stick. And before we do anything, there's a computer that has a simulation, a pool simulation, and you enter how hard you're going to hit the white ball and at what angle. And then you press simulate, and you see the white ball moving towards the triangle. It hits the red balls and they all start bouncing off the cushions and off each other. And at the end, there's a final pattern that lays on the table, and that's all in the computer simulator. And if you hit the white ball at exactly the same angle with exactly the same force, the magic is that what is showing up on the computer simulator will be exactly what shows up on the physical billiard table or pool table. Because if the initial impulse is a certain way and the circumstance is a closed system of particular rules, then the outcome will only be one way. And so we can see that we can tell what the outcome is going to be before the event even happens. So the outcome already exists. It's already happened. Where we can't understand this is because there is a belief that there is a separate, independent entity living life, an entity that is unaffected by anything else, an entity that makes decisions in each moment. And so this imagined entity is the curveball in the example, because it says, well, you can't account for me. I'm the one that makes a decision in this moment that you can't possibly account for. But when we look at the decisions that the individuals make, we find that they're all based on the biology of the human being, which is physics. So science will tell, not that I'm relying on science for these pointers, this is not about just science, but we can't discount a objective analysis. Science is very good usually when there's a very good scientist. They understand a lot of things that working mind doesn't really understand about what conclusions we can and can't make based on having seen certain things. And so science can verify objective things very well. And science tells us that thinking is simply a function of the brain, which is a very complex set of neural networks, electromagnetics. And so what we think is my thinking is actually exactly this, are happening according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if we can start to see the biology of the human being, the biological aspect of the human being for what it is, biological, and therefore unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold according to the biological makeup, then there can be a awakening to that part of the human being that is not biological. Because the third factor of the human being is the consciousness. But the consciousness doesn't function as a biological aspect. The consciousness provides the sense of being and the awareness that is aware of whatever is happening biologically. So to the extent that we can start to see the biological movements as biological, the identification with those functions starts to fall away. And when we look at our suffering is always based on personalizing an impersonal function, which means identifying with something we're not. The suffering, the not knowing ourselves, is identifying with an aspect that is not what we are and assuming it to be what we are. And in this case, more simply put, it's believing that I am the doer of everything that I think, feel, and do, rather than seeing that as a biological happening that is part of the story of life and destined to happen, which means in each moment there is going to be a biological reaction to the circumstance at hand. So if someone finds themselves confronted by an aggressive animal, they might fight, they might freeze, or they might run away scared. And that is a biological reaction to a circumstance based on the person's genes and up-to-date conditioning. The psychological response then comes in and judges the biological reaction as appropriate or inappropriate, good or bad, what I should or shouldn't have done. And that psychological judgment of what happened is the suffering. And the judgment is based on, I am the one that ran away. I am the one that stood and fought. And I shouldn't have run away, that was cowardly, or I shouldn't have stood and fought, that was stupid, whatever the situation would be. Instead of just seeing that was a biological reaction in the moment, what happened exactly the way it was meant to, it was destined to happen according to the story of life. I wasn't in control of the circumstance, and I wasn't in control of how biologically I reacted. So everything is a happening according to God's will. Remember, this is not a God that is out there. This is a God that has become the experience, has become the universe. God that has become the victim and the perpetrator. God that has become the vicious animal, let's say, and the one that either ran away or the one that fought or the one that froze. God has become the one that watched and did something about it or didn't do something about it. God has become the whole experience.
Then whether God is the doer?
So the question was, is God the doer? First we have to find God.
Yeah, the question is, if I am not the doer, then who am I? If I am not the doer, then who am I?
It's a great question. You're not the doer.
Yeah, no. What I'm asking is, if I am not the doer, then we are talking about God. He has taken up every form and he is doing with himself. Then whether God is the doer, and who am I? To whom this I am is referring to as I?
To who?
To whom this I am is referring itself as I?
So, if the belief I am the doer falls away, a lot that is gets revealed. The belief I am the doer tends to be a veil to seeing what lies beneath that veil. So just the question, well, if I am not the doer, who am I, is enough. Because it indicates, okay, I have understood the concept. I am not the doer. I am not the doer means it's not even I am not the doer, because otherwise we can come up with the idea, oh, I am this, but I am not the doer. And that's how we end up living. Actually, I am this, but I am not the doer. But before we say I am this, but I'm not the doer, the notion of non-doership points to something very profound. The implication is, if I am not this, because this is the one that is moving, if I am not the biological, then what am I? Or who am I?
Yeah.
So really, if we see first you might understand it intellectually, that I am not the doer, meaning really what it's saying is you are not the biological. Not only saying you are the biological but you are not the doer, but rather, if I am not the biological, who am I? The I am, so I won't answer the question, really. Maybe I'll say I won't, and then I'll put a whole lot of words onto it. Well, let's look at Ramana's core teaching, self-inquiry, using the question, who am I?
Yeah.
Nisargadatta's core teaching, abide in I am.
Yes.
I would suggest that Ramana's or Nisargadatta's teaching is the answer to Ramana's question.
Yeah, that is the presence. That existential presence that knows itself as witness to everything.
Mm-hmm.
That one is not the doer.
That's right. And so the answer is not an answer that we write down in words or that we say. When you are being what Nisargadatta suggests, abide in I am,
Yeah.
the question, who am I, falls away.
No, since this is one intellectual discussion, and through that intellect we are reaching ourselves. The original one is reaching to itself. What happens when there is a choice? There are options. Suppose we are doing something may go wrong also. That is just happening. Suppose there are 4-5 choices. Then what happens? Who makes the choice?
The choice is a result of the circumstance that the body finds itself in, and the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning. So what we have believed to be my choice, me as the doer, turns out to be a biological reaction to a circumstance. And so life unfolds through choice being made. This is clear. In each moment, a choice needs to be made. We find ourselves in a circumstance. There are several options, and at some point, one of the options is chosen. So that is choice.
Yeah.
But when we look at that dynamic and see it in the light presented here, that choice is based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that we were not in control of. Part of the biological entity. So when we see, that choice is not my choice, but a happening. A happening according to the circumstance I find myself and the biological makeup in this moment. The outcome of that choice, not in our control. Sometimes we get what we want and sometimes we don't. So both in theory and in practice, we find I'm not in control. Not in control of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Not in control of the circumstance. Not in control of the reaction that happens, which is in this case a choice. And not in control of the outcome. Sometimes I get what I want and sometimes I don't. And what am I, in essence, is, we can say, that which is aware of everything that is happening. And that is only useful, as far as I'm concerned, to awaken to the essence of the human being. To understand that what I am in essence is formless and not biological. But I never experience myself in the absence of the body. That in daily life there is always the combination of the formless and the body functioning together. So after the awakening to the fact that what I am in essence is not the body is a vehicle through which what I am functions. Once there's awakening to that, then we have to drop the fact that I am just the formless and realize that in practice the formless always coincides with the body. And the personal consciousness experience is an experience of me feeling like I am the body, feeling like I am the doer, I am the chooser. So then we recognize that the feeling of free will, the feeling of being the body, is part of the experience. I don't need to deny that. I don't need to try and escape that. I can then function exactly as I'm designed to function, doing in each moment whatever I think or feel I should do based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and knowing that that is automatic. I still have to suffer the consequences. That's my experience, that the consequences are either pleasurable or painful. And so then we end up living as if I am this, knowing that what this is actually the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a particular body. The junction point is the spiritual heart. That's the junction point where impersonal consciousness links to the body. And the feeling of being that is available for us to know in this moment. The feeling of being in the spiritual heart, which is the junction point, is the feeling of I am, impersonal I am, which means I exist. What exists when we rest in that place of being is unknown. It's not defined, but there is the undeniable sense of existence, which means I can't deny that in this moment I am. If I ask you the question, are you dead? You don't need to think about it. You don't need to conceptualize, well, am I dead or am I not? The undeniable experience is I am, meaning I exist. So we know the answer is no, I am not dead. I am. When we rest in the heart, the I am is not I am this or that. It's just impersonal I am. But then we have to come and live life as this, as Roger, and knowing that Roger is a combination of that impersonal consciousness, that impersonal I am, plus the clothing of the body, which from this understanding means that when the body is challenged physically, that is seen as pleasure or pain, and we know that the essence is not touched. And even death, which is the annihilation of the body, is seen to be the end of the personal consciousness experience, the end of the Rogerness. It lives its destined lifespan, and at some point that story is over. And if the belief in personal doership, which obstructs our connection to Source, if that's faded away, then all of the holding on to life, holding on to the experience of life because we feel we are defined by the content of life, that falls away too. And then even death is not seen as an attack on who I am. And then life, as it unfolds, day after day, the pain, which normally is received as a mini death, is no longer taken to be an attack on who I am either. Which means we get to live connected to Source, knowing our connection to Source, knowing the impersonalness, but living personally. Living personally, but knowing the impersonalness of it all. So it sounds very intellectual maybe. What it's pointing at is this place of being, which is completely not intellectual. And then once the resting in being happens more and more frequently, the working mind can come in and function. And the working mind, which is not an uncomfortableness with oneself, not based on a false idea of who we are, the working mind then no longer disturbs our peace of mind. It no longer creates a disconnection from Source. And the thinking mind no longer happens, because the thinking mind is based on these false beliefs that I am the doer, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure.
Thank you.
Roger, you spoke about universal consciousness and us as personal consciousness, and I would like to ask the question, but comparing with the movie Matrix, I presume that many people watch the movie. There is central system called Matrix, and all people are connected with central system. All of them are in some capsule, and they are connected with the center, and they all dream some life somewhere, but it's not the truth. They are all in some physical place, and they feed the system. But I presume that it is vice versa in real life. A system feeds the personal consciousness, but obviously something prevents us to see the connection. Connection obviously exists, but as we have some, let's say, little devil that presents that it's us, and he or she all the time whispering to us, maybe it's not the truth. You see evidence in your personal life. You really have house in Paris, and we imagine that we speak to ourselves. And in some point you spoke about entities, or let's say dark energies. Are there such things that prevents us to see the real truth? Because physically, obviously, it's not the problem. We all know that I know that I am, and it's not hard to explain me, as you say, intellectually. But I'm not. I don't see myself as impersonal consciousness. Let's say experientially, or I don't experience it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, so where do we start? I would suggest that it's the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, which is not a belief just on the conscious level. It's not a belief that we can see that runs past saying, I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in pleasure. It's a belief on a deeply, deeply ingrained level. It's that belief that is the veil, the obstruction to the recognition of our connection to Source. Because the belief that says, I am the doer, effectively makes me an independent, separate entity. I am the doer means I am the one that chooses of my own free will, unaffected by anything else, unconditioned by anything else. There is this entity that is pure, that is the chooser. And so that entity doesn't exist. So if we see it, if the mind, if the thinking creates that in the form of beliefs, it's not seeing things accurately. It's not seeing life as it really is, which means it sees an imagined entity that is the chooser, and it simultaneously cuts off the recognition of our connection to Source, meaning the recognition that I am an expression of Source, that whatever happens through me is an expression of Source. So if the concept that I am not the doer and the other is not the doer, that everything is happening, is really understood first intellectually, meaning it's really quite simple intellectually. I'm not the doer because everything that happens through me is biological. The thinking, the emotions, the reactions to circumstance, biological. And we simply don't experience it as biological. We experience it as my doing and happening to what I am because of these beliefs. So if the intellectual understanding is that's how it's experienced, that it's my doing and it's happening to me, but that experience is not a reflection of truth, then awareness can start seeing deeper than the experience. And seeing, yes, whatever happens, the fact I get afraid when I see a dog is based on my genes and my up-to-date conditioning. And my up-to-date conditioning includes an event when I was, let's say, 10 years old, where I was attacked by a dog. And so we start to see that reaction that seems like my reaction is something that is forced on me based on an event that happened in my history that I had no control over. And someone else who had up-to-date conditioning where their relationship with dogs was very rewarding, like they had a nice pet at home, will see a dog and will have a completely different reaction to the dog. So it's really about as simple as that. Seeing my reaction to how someone speaks to me. Someone looks at me and gives me a glare instead of a smile. And we react a certain way. We have a thought about, oh, he's having a bad day, or whatever the thought is. It might not be he's having a bad day. It's like, why does he look at me like this? What does it mean about me? Whatever the thought is a reaction based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Maybe we should leave it at that, because it's really that simple. And so all of the talk that is saying exactly that.
This part that lady said, I'm controlling my arm. Scientists did some experiments, and they found that 10% of the second, it's, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
First, we make physical movement, and then brain acts, which goes in line with your talking that we are not in control. But obviously, all of us are very afraid because we have impression that we are puppets.
Yeah, so that's right. The movement happens, and then we claim ownership over the movement. Half a second or 0.3 of a second after the movement, when the awareness recognizes what the movement is. And the mind will think that if I recognize that I'm not the doer, then life is going to change for the worse. But actually, life has always been like this. We've never been the doer. No one in all of history has ever done anything. And it's simply a belief, an attitude to what is happening. So the doership is an attitude of doership to what has never been my doing. And to recognize this attitude of doership to everything that has just been happening for our whole life, never been my doing, means that we we just drop a false attitude. It doesn't mean that suddenly we will feel like we are puppets on the end of a string. The reason we don't feel like we're puppets on the end of the string is because the experience is designed to include the feeling of free will. Now, this feeling of free will is a gift because it means that we get to live as if I am the doer, but deep, deep down knowing that everything is happening. It's a gift, but at the same time, it's the feeling that has created the confusion. So if we can come to see that this feeling of free will is always going to be there. The feeling of free will is not the problem. The problem is the belief that has been formed about who we are based on the experience that presents itself. And we just need to start to dissolve the belief, which is not our doing actually, it's life starts to dissolve the belief. And as that belief dissolves, there is a relaxation into life. Oh, you mean I am not the one that has been controlling life? I don't have to control life, I can relax? Yes, we relax, and what we find is that there is a biological intelligence that continues to function. It functions much more efficiently when the thinking mind stops when the thinking mind is not present. The working mind is then allowed to Mhm. Yes. I still feel that there is like a separate entity here. I still feel separate from you. So if they're still they are connected to the same source, then why is it do I feel that they are separate from you? Do you want to not feel separate from me?
Something there still wanting to feel separate from you. Is that why?
No, is there something that wants to not feel separate from me? What's wrong with feeling separate from me?
Because it doesn't
make sense if everything is connected to the same source. I should not see myself as separate from everything else that is not in.
So because the radio and the TV are connected to the same source, does that mean that they have to know each other? The two instruments have to know each other?
right now. The problem is that they have misidentified itself as the radio. The radio thinks itself as a radio, and that is why it is not in touch with the impersonal consciousness.
So our connection that we're looking for is a connection to the source, not a connection to all the other objects. And that connection to source allows us to then see, when we know ourself as an instrument through which source is functioning, we then see the other as an instrument through which the same source is functioning, knowing that the experience is always going to be a personal experience. That seeing our connection to source doesn't change it from being a personal experience. This is one of the misunderstandings that needs to be corrected at some point, that the personal experience will dissolve and that we will end up living in an experience of oneness or an impersonal experience. That's the awakening of the essence of awareness in which the whole universe arises. But once we awaken to that essence, it then needs to be integrated back into the body, where we end up living as this, having an experience that is personal to this, where I don't feel myself to be the same as the computer or the tree or the other people, but know myself to always be connected to source. And so from that perspective, the issue of unhappiness in life is completely addressed. And that's why at the beginning of each talk, it's like, what are we really looking for? So that we don't end up getting lost in concepts that are not helpful concepts. So what are we really looking for? We're looking for happiness for the human being. And unhappiness for the human being arises in these forms of suffering. It turns out that happiness is just the end of that unhappiness. The unhappiness is, in practical terms, guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation. And when we look at the basis of the veil, the unhappiness that actually gets in the way of what we're really looking for, we find it's this belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And in practice, what I've found is that when I dropped the idea that enlightenment was about something that I thought it was, and started going down to this practical explanation, saying, actually, what am I really looking for? Why is this seeking happening? And I find the seeking is happening because of an uncomfortableness with oneself. And intuitively, we know that suffering is not natural. It's very common. It's part of the story of life. So in Buddhism, the first noble truth, life is suffering, because it's so common. It's part of the error that's been put in place by life. So when we look at it, we say, intuitively we know that suffering is not natural. And the seeking is a seeking away from suffering. So Buddha, as I came to relate to Buddhism, made it very simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering, and the cause of suffering is desire. And so if we keep it practical, then we won't tend to get lost in an idea of what enlightenment is, that is maybe something that's not available. And so as part of my particular process, I was exposed to the traditional non-dual teachings, which I have a great respect for. I think they're essential. Well, when I say essential, in my experience, it was essential for the non-dual teachings to move attention from being obsessed with one side of the coin, which is I am the body, to see the other side. And how that does it is it basically says you are not the body, and that everything is one, and it points, it needs to make this unreal in order for attention to land on this side of the coin, which is the recognition of the essence of life. And what we tend to do is go from being obsessed with one side of the coin, seeing only one side of the coin, to then seeing only the other side of the coin and saying this doesn't exist. And at the end of the day, a coin is a coin, which means we need to see it as a coin with two faces, which is coming to hold the paradox in life. And when we realize, wow, these certain teachings have allowed me to shift from being obsessed with one coin to see the other side, but now I'm obsessed with this side. And so Ramana's teaching includes the notion of use this thorn to remove the thorn which is embedded in your thumb, but then be sure to throw both thorns away. And so the thorn embedded in your thumb are the existing beliefs of what life is and who we are that are wrong. And the thorn which we use to uproot the ingrained thorn is a concept, a spiritual concept. Let's say that everything is one. It's a spiritual concept. So use that to undo the existing beliefs. Why that saying is there is not because we will do that and throw both thorns away, but because the one that is embedded in our thumb will be replaced by the spiritual concept. It's inevitable. And so the saying there is pointing to the fact to look and see whether that second thorn has become a new thorn in the thumb. And then a third thorn will be used to uproot that. And so this idea, for example, which it makes complete sense that you put forward this idea that, well, if it's the one source, then I should know everything. But actually, it's probably stemming from this idea of oneness. So it makes sense, but my suggestion is to look at it and say, why do I believe that? Maybe it's not available. Maybe that's not what the enlightened state of living is. So you then at least you just question it. And if we see it as a belief, we go, wow, it's a belief, and it could well be an expectation that I have. And I speak from personal experience, because that's what the process was with going to Ramesh, is that he could see that certain profound insights had happened, and that when we had discussions coming from the esoteric non-dual perspective, we were able to have the discussions. And the process was really one of, okay, so you've come back down here. And one of the occasions was when I flew to Mumbai, because I had just had a very profound oneness experience that demonstrated in unspeakable terms the content of books like I Am That and Ramana's talks. And so it made sense that my intellect drew the conclusion, that is it. This is enlightenment, that oneness experience. Because the experience matched perfectly all of these profound descriptions. And when I went to Ramesh, I waited, and he saw me, and we had a nice relationship. So he asked me, "Oh, nice to see you, Roger. What brings you here?" And I said, "Well, look, this," and I described this experience, which I said wasn't an experience, because to me it was not an experience. There was a falling away of subject-object relationship, and it was quiet and peaceful, and many other insights presented in that experience, which I wasn't relating to as an experience. And I described it very much better than I could now, because back then I was very familiar with all the correct words to use and not use, based on the seeing of the oneness of everything. And after my first complex explanation, he said, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And nothing of that resonated at all. So I thought, oh, you just didn't understand. I didn't explain it properly, so I tried to explain it again. "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And so I had one more go at trying to fill in any gaps that I maybe had left, but I thought I'd done a very good job. And he said again a third time, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And I left feeling, well, maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he hasn't had this shift. And I went back to Australia, and some weeks went past, and I noticed that I was waiting for it to happen again in a way that would be complete and remain unbroken and stay for the rest of my life. And I'd walk down the same path, waiting for it to happen in the same place. And as it didn't happen again, I started to notice that there was this suffering that was happening, based on waiting for this final state to finally kick in. And I thought, it's not far away because it's happened already. And when I noticed the suffering, which I had become very familiar with what suffering looked like along the lines of expectation, and I realized, what if he's right? What if I have an idea of what it looks like, and that idea is wrong? And it just clicked in that moment that that's what was happening. And from then on, I dropped the idea that it looks like anything in particular, and just went back to this very clear explanation, which I could verify for myself based on my own experience. What I'm really looking for is the end of suffering, peace of mind in daily living. And sure, the peace of mind was available in that experience. But it also became clear from my own experience that suffering had become very minimal, even without a oneness experience. And that's when it dawned on me, it's like, who cares about a oneness experience if the peace of mind that I'm looking for, the happiness that I'm looking for, who cares if I don't have a oneness experience if it's delivered in another format? And that's when the peak experiences that I was having lots of started to fall away, because the mindset now was really focusing on what was left there that was creating the resistance to life. And what was left was very much this very ordinary thinking of expectation in the future, guilt and blame. And there wasn't a lot of guilt or blame. What I found was there was some expectation in the future of what this whole process was. And very quickly, it all started to collapse when I realized that the teachings that created the awakening had become an obstacle in themselves. And the teachings themselves, those teachings tell us all the time, don't believe anything that is said. It's not the truth. These are all concepts. If you see Buddha on the road, kill him. Pointing at the fact that don't hold on to anything, not even the teacher, not even the teaching. And we're lucky when life delivers these little shifts that shift our thinking, and a great amount of new perspective comes in. So I don't know anyone else's experience, but I know that peace of mind on a continuous, unbroken basis is there, regardless of circumstance. Pleasure sometimes, pain at others. And so the Ramesh often used to say is that enlightenment won't give you special powers, won't allow you to be in two places at once. It won't mean that whenever you're looking for a parking spot, that there will be a parking spot. It gives you something very simple, just the end of suffering. And the experience is then very ordinary, very much of being this individual, but with an understanding of what the human experience is, what the individual is. No longer seeing the individual as a separate entity, but rather an entity that is connected to Source all the time, an entity that Source is functioning through. And so Ramesh would refer to Ramana because he had great respect for Ramana, and so do I. And he said Ramana was the ego. The ego doesn't die. The ego is the body, the vehicle, plus impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through that body as personal consciousness. We start off with an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And after this transformation, you end up with an ego without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which means Ramana still had identification with name and form, not identification in the way that is typically used where we are completely obsessed with something we're not. Identification with name and form, as it's referred to in the scriptures or Vedas, is the linking of consciousness to a particular body, creating the sense of I am, and then that consciousness functioning from a personal perspective. And so it would be Ramana would get up from his bed in the satsang hall or the couch and walk to the food hall. And the assumption is that Ramana felt like Ramana was eating his food, not the space. And yet then in meditation, the experience can change radically to one of the falling away of the daily life experience, which continually reaffirms that the daily life experience of being this is not a reality. In any moment, the experience can change, where the sense of the individual in a particular moment could fall away. But then it comes back, and it coming back is not the problem. It's when it comes back with this attachment to pleasure and attachment to outcomes and feeling like I am the doer, where we blame the other and blame ourselves. And that deeply ingrained belief means there's this subtle background of uncomfortableness all the time. So as that dissolves, there's peace, but the experience doesn't necessarily have to change as radically as we think. Yeah.
Good evening, Mr. Roger. Me and my friend, we had a conversation about self-inquiry for the past 6 months. So there was a particular topic that we were talking about, which is personalities or character, which in later on it will influence the behavior or emotions actually. So all our life, our personalities and characters has been influenced by our parents. We have picked up from them, or from our friends, or even from our actors or that we idol about. So when we peeled all of it off, so we were thinking, what are we actually? What is the originality in it actually? So when we're thinking about it, there's something in us which says, who's asking this question? Alright? So when we were thinking who's asking this question, the mind actually projects back to itself and says, I'm asking it. So this is the tricky part actually. And then you'll be wondering, who's actually really asking the question? Is it the mind or itself?
Mm-hmm.
Alright? There are moments that will be, there'll be an experience where like, you'll be like jumping into a cliff, or when somebody is holding on you, or there'll be some other scenarios which will be resulted with complete silence or momentary silence which lasts for 2-3 seconds. So I was thinking, what's next to it, or what's the next stage to it actually?
Mm-hmm.
So after all the silentary moments appears, right after that mind comes in and says, no, it could be mind games actually playing to you.
Mm-hmm. So this is another thing that we need to really assess. Are we looking for complete silence? Is that what enlightened living is?
No, I didn't expect any of it actually. I didn't even expected the emptiness or silence.
Sure.
It was just about momentary silence that I have never expected.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking that I would be completely full of joy, or full of ecstatic moments, something like that. But it was just emptiness.
Yep.
So I've been having this kind of moments for not frequently, but quite not infrequently actually, but very rare times occurrence.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking, what is it actually? What is it which is something which I don't know? Something is so empty. So what's the next to it actually? Should I go deeper into it?
Yeah, well, this is the process unfolding, what you're describing. So we don't really do it. It happens. The whole process, even when we say, okay, now I'm going to do this, really my experience was that if I was controlling this process, I would have messed it up on day one. It's all unfolding perfectly. So very synchronistically. The books that get read, and then the circumstances in life that demonstrate what we've just read, the thinking that happens, the moments of silence that happen. When we really get realistic about looking at it, we say, wow, this is all happening, not my doing. Especially when the moment of silence happens. You definitely didn't make that happen. And what the moment of silence can show us is that what is mind and what is not mind, let's say. So the thought that says, who asks the question? To me, it's very clear. The mind asks the question, and then the mind asks, who asks the question? That's the awareness doesn't have the function of thinking. Awareness doesn't have a function of contemplating or even insight. Awareness simply is aware. And that silence is a space when the mind stops. Just to show us a contrast, so that we can then start to answer a question, like you said, who asked the question? Because the silence doesn't ask any questions. The silence doesn't have any insights. It just is. And then we become clear on what part of the momentary experience is thinking and what part is the silence. But this is where the concept of the working mind and the thinking mind is so important. Because when you have that experience that you described, the assumption could be, now I just need this silence to be there for an extended period of time. And that can be a mistake. If we think that we can live life in complete silence, we'll be expecting something that's not available, and we might find ourselves meditating obsessively to try and have this silence. If we come to see the difference between the thinking mind and the working mind, and see the thinking mind as the part of the mind that disturbs us, that is an uncomfortableness. The thinking mind is the guilt and the blame and the attachment to outcomes. The working mind is still thinking. So like the question, who am I, for example, could be part of the working mind.
At that point, I do realize that the mind is asking that question, but something's aware of that question. Actually, something is looking at these questions. So actually, the mind's asking back at the something which is aware of it, right?
The mind is asking?
Actually, the mind turns back and asking who's really aware of this question.
Yeah.
Right?
And at that point, if the mind realizes that the question is not the awareness, but the question is the mind, the mind itself stops. When the thinking mind is looking for silence, for example, or the thinking, no, sorry, not the thinking mind, when the working mind is looking for silence, or the working mind is trying to get the thinking to stop, what we can find ourselves doing is the thinking recognizes the last thought and says, oh, that's thinking. And then, because it presents itself as a thought that says that's thinking, then that last thought is recognized that that's thinking too. It's recognized by another thought. And then the last thought, which says that's thinking too, is recognized by another thought and says, and that's thinking as well. And then that last thought, and that's thinking as well, is recognized by another thought, and that's more thinking. And at some point, there's a recognition that says, if the mind keeps seeing the last thought and commenting on it, it's the mind in continuum. And the mind actually realizes, I have to just stop. And at that point, there can be a stop, which can lead to like the silence that you talked about. So it's one way or the other, the mind turns in, not on so much on it points to the awareness and realizes that to really point at the awareness, it needs to stop. But what's the purpose of that? The purpose is to just show us, to start contrasting our human experience and showing there is an awareness that is aware of all the thinking, there is awareness that is aware of the pleasure and the pain, and that awareness is the background that is unchanging and is unaffected by whatever comes and goes. So that's a very important insight and recognition. It's a recognition of self, the formless essence of self. And where to from there? Once that's really understood to always be the background, then it's to find that where that ground functions through the human. And if we then start to see that background, which is a container, can express itself either as awareness of everything that is, or it can come back and function through the body, as the awareness functioning through the eyes. Because once it starts to present itself as the background, we feel very open, and we tend to hang out in this impersonal space. And maybe it's about coming back into the body and becoming aware of that same awareness functioning through the body as consciousness. And then that's the consciousness that is looking at you, and the consciousness that from your perspective is looking at me. So that's the integrating of the recognition of the background of awareness back into the body. there are really different phases in this process, and the question you ask is very valid, but we can't get too concerned about where to next, because if we think where to next too much, it's like, where do I have to go next? So we can even see the question where to next is possibly coming from this belief in doership, that I need to control where to go next. And if we recognize this process is happening, and I don't really need to, the fact that you're interested in, you come to satsangs, you read books, you have friends that you're doing self-inquiry with, and you have these sort of dialogues, that's it happening. So there's no doubt that tomorrow, what next will present itself. That's the surrender, actually. So we've gone over time again, which is not really a problem for me, but rather than keeping people here who might have places to go, we'll call it a day. So thank you, everyone.